then I'll be very happy to take any questions that you have, and I hope not to bore you completely to death. So the topic, my talk is called Violence as Salvation. And I'd like to begin by quoting a 19th century African-American social reformer, orator, writer, and statesman, Frederick Douglass. Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." Power concedes nothing without a demand. So let's talk about power, about the way we understand power in all its different dimensions. The way power is exercised today is mostly, of course, in the name of good. The purveyors of power and those who are its recipients often construe its deployment as an act of benevolence, or at least of eventual improvement, if not salvation. And now, as someone who works in independent media, I want to talk about why it's imperative to question the use of power, even as its professed intentions are noble. Its locus is more and more dispersed, and its reach is virtually infinite, especially as we live in the only imperial state remaining, whose influence is felt tangibly and less tangibly all over the world. Keeping in mind, again, what Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. Now, there are several manifestations of the reach of this power, but let's just start with the most obvious. And let me once again reiterate, we live in the most powerful country in the world. The US has a military footprint, in some cases small, in some cases enormous, in over 100 countries in the world. It remains the determining voice, the determining presence in extremely powerful multilateral institutions, including the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and NATO, to name only some of the most prominent, whose decisions massively impact levels of security, poverty, health, of the very fact of life and death for billions of people around the world, and most notably and most perceptibly, and of course the most vulnerable, those in what is still sometimes called the third world. So there is the power that is exercised visibly, as when the US invades another country or uses its veto power in the Security Council of the United Nations, or when it imprisons people without charge in indefinite detention, something with which we're increasingly familiar. But that's obvious and visible. But there are other forms of power exercised in less tangible, but no less violent ways. There's the power the US has in determining the contours of the global economy, an economy that is more and more pervasive, more and more determining. The items that are traded at what cost, with tariffs imposed on some and not others, protectionist measures for US producers and products, and restrictions on others imposing similar tariffs. There's then the global power of US corporations, manifesting itself most recently, of course, in the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, when the leading banks of this country indulged in the financial fraud that we have become familiar with, but for which, of course, no punitive measures were taken. Globally, corporations often exploit cheap labor, wiping out local businesses, and then, of course, more prosaically, come in some sense to dominate the local landscape, as, for instance, when one is greeted in Santiago, or in Durban, or in Karachi by a giant gold M, advertising burgers and fries, always altered, of course, to fit the local palate, and yet clearly marked by the US, emblazoned with empire, as it were. There is then the power of US popular culture, television and film, Hollywood available in every corner of the world, bringing with it the full force of America's military omnipotence, its ceaseless war games, its apocalyptic imagination, its sentimental romances. And of course, there is the power of the most powerful tool we, as human beings, possess, the power of speech, of language, and this language, our language, is now the language of the internet, the economy. In other words, this is the language of those instruments that shape hundreds of millions, in fact, billions of lives. So this, very schematically and very simply, is where we begin. Now, with such a beginning, we can ask, what kind of responsibility does such power entail? What demand can we possibly place before this power? And in the hope of what concession? And on whom does this responsibility fall? Of course, in a sense, the responsibility falls on all of us. But what is the particular and peculiar responsibility that journalists bear in an imperial state? Or simply put, and to reiterate again, what responsibility do journalists bear when they live in the most powerful country in the world, the most powerful country that has ever existed? The role of the media, one could argue, is the same everywhere. But where we live in this country places a special burden on us. Amy Goodman, whom I mentioned before, and whom you all know, often says that the role of the press is to act as the fourth estate and not for the state. And I think that is the singular failing of our media as it operates today. The question is often framed in the American context as one of partisanship. The media are partisan, we're told. Some channels and publications are liberal, voicing only democratic perspectives, the perspectives of the Democratic Party. Others are conservative and only give voice to Republicans. It's a partisan issue, we're told. And I won't argue with that because in some sense, I'm sure it's true. But there is a much larger problem, which appears very difficult to perceive. And that has to do with the fact that the media is not sufficiently critical or critical at all of the American state, no matter who occupies its highest offices, Republican or Democrat. We should keep in mind that certain institutions in this country, and they don't need to be named, are far more powerful than the individuals who come and go within them. So there's very little said of the extent to which the media often serve as the spokespersons for American state power, as it's projected outward and, of course, also inward. It's hardly controversial to suggest, for instance, that the mainstream media's performance in the lead-up to the Iraq War was really nothing short of catastrophic. Some say in retrospect that they had been critical of the White House's claims, but many argue that they could do nothing else since everyone was in agreement on the intelligence regarding Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Of course, it's not true. A handful of journalists did point out that there were problems with what the White House was claiming, but they were simply ignored. Some even went so far as to say that Saddam Hussein worked directly with Al-Qaeda, and that Iraqis would greet Americans as liberators. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times were among the most prominent publications supporting the forceful US overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime. The Washington Post editorialized in favor of the war 27 times, publishing 1,000 articles and columns on the war. But coverage of the anti-war movement, which was the largest anti-war movement that has ever taken place, got a total of 36 words. So here we see acutely, in the context of a willing and compliant media, how violence is exercised with utter impunity, the consequences of which, of course, are still with us, and even more so, and far more devastatingly so, of course, with the people of Iraq. So what are the links between power and violence, and of what kind of violence are we speaking? There is, of course, this violence, the violence of missiles and bombs, of occupation and dispossession, of the destruction of economies and institutions. Then there's the violence given to us as entertainment, endless numbers of video games and films and television programs. And then there's the violence that is presented to us from near and far, the violence we know occurs in our communities, gun violence and rape and domestic abuse and murder. And then, exponentially more, I would say, if only because it is also invisible, the violence we are shielded from, this insidious violence, which structures so much of so many lives. That is the violence of economic inequality, growing and devastating in this country as well. Structural and imperceptible violence, the violence of poverty and hunger, of incarceration and deprivation, the withholding of services from health to education, and countless others. These are forms of violence, locally, nationally, globally, of which we are made only barely aware. So the question is, how are we to make demands in the face of a power and of a violence that is all-pervasive and that is less and less discernible to us? And we must also examine how it is that we're allowed to perceive and understand the violence with which we're confronted, how we're made to view certain forms of violence as acceptable, maybe even desirable, whereas other forms of violence are condemned in a virtually universal chorus of horror and opprobrium as barbaric. What is it that has altered or perhaps simply shaped our perceptions of the violence we know occurs, the violence that is often brought to us on our television and computer screens? Just think, for example, of our response to the violence that was unleashed in Afghanistan after October 7th, 2001, the violence of aerial bombardment that continued for as long as it did. How is it that we responded to the deaths that occurred, that perhaps continue to occur in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, in their hundreds of thousands? A bombing, even if those deaths were unintentional. Now think of our response to the virtual ubiquity of suicide bombings, whether in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or Pakistan. What is it that makes the latter appear so much more horrific? Or more horrific still, the infamous videos posted on YouTube of various militant groups beheading some hapless foreigner, or more often, some hapless native. What seems to be at issue here is not so much the scale of the violence, the numbers killed, for instance, but rather the means used to kill and the alleged or professed motive or intention of the perpetrator. In other words, when a suicide bomber carries out an attack, we are horrified by the means. What kind of fanatic would kill themselves along with others? And by the goal, what kind of world do they hope to create? And the intent, how can they kill so unapologetically, without remorse, as it were? And furthermore, and perhaps most horrifying still, we can abide least of all murder at such close proximity. What does it say about the killer who can look his victim in the eyes and behead him, or slaughter him with a machete, or explode his own body along with others? What is it now about face-to-face killing that renders it so much more unacceptable to our moral sensibility? And yet another form of violence exercised by and in the name of benevolent power. This may sound familiar to us, but only as a historical fact, scarcely one construed as violent, and yet it continues to this day, because its effects have been determining and are ongoing for countless around the world. And this has to do with the psychic costs, the psychic violence of colonialism, and in particular of colonial education, and I mean education in the most expansive sense of the term. The most beautiful and the most tragic rendering of this phenomenon I read most recently by a Zimbabwean author whose name is Tsitsi Dagaremga in her book called Nervous Conditions. The title comes from the introduction by Jean-Paul Sartre to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. The full sentence reads, "The condition of the native is a nervous condition, introduced and maintained by the settler among colonized people with their consent." Dagarenga provides a devastating account of the emotional and psychological weight that immersion in a foreign, and of course in a colonial context, far superior culture produces. This weight, this violence, of course, continues to be borne by colonized people around the world in settler colonies, like this one. Think of the attempts at cultural assimilation among what remain of the indigenous populations in the Americas, and informally colonized ones across Africa and Asia. Again, I don't want to comment on the material gains from bearing such violence, or the so-called consent of those who submitted to the violence. But if one has no say in the world that's being created, to eventually hope one day to become its beneficiary is perhaps small consolation. And all this too in the name of civilization, of bringing a better way of life to billions around the world. So yes, good intentions also, and still the violence must not be denied and cannot be undone. So perhaps the question of intent, the emphasis on intention, is something we need to think more about. After all, even at the most basic level, when was the last time you heard anyone in any context profess evil intent? Anyone say they will do something to hurt someone else for no other reason than they want to cause harm to another? On the rare occasion people admit at all having the intention to hurt someone, they always say it is because they did something to them first. So in other words, it is an act of self-defense. And most wars are fought on precisely the same basis. Certainly the argument and intent expressed in the US invasion of Afghanistan was defensive. They attacked us first. Similarly with the use of nuclear weapons in Japan. How else to respond to Pearl Harbor? The examples are legion. And yet we know now from our everyday lives and from political life that despite only the best intentions, or at least only ever benevolent ones, people are hurt all the time. People are killed, raped, and wounded. So how might we understand the question of intent better? And this is, of course, bracketing for the moment the psychoanalytic insight that the problem with intention, determining one or professing one, is that, of course, our intentions are often the most opaque to us. So perhaps this merits some reflection, especially given the emphasis on intention when violence is waged. And here I'd like to clarify, I'm not adjudicating on any form of violence, much less trying to make an argument that one is better or worse than another, or that violence cannot retrospectively be justified by the benefits it brings in its wake. The natives now speak French. What would they do if they could not? The women of Afghanistan are free. What would happen if they had not been? Here too, though, we should remember that history is, alas and unfortunately, written by the victors and not by the vanquished. So what I'm trying to do is simply point to the fact that certain forms of violence have been rendered more horrifying, and that that horror seems to coincide with their violence. And simultaneously, it is our violence that is rendered more acceptable, if also less visible, and perhaps even necessary. There is also, lastly but importantly, the issue of yet another kind of violence, which we've often witnessed, and which we hear of in the news, which is practiced, as we are told, only as a means of preventing further violence. And this goes, of course, by the name of humanitarian intervention. And one often hears a distinction made between the exercise of imperial power in the 18th and 19th century, the wars for colonial domination, though even in these wars, there was never only a predatory goal that was professed. And those wars, humanitarian wars, that are driven by empathy for victims of violence. But the problem is that such a distinction can't be so neatly drawn, even if one assumes that colonial intentions were only bad, and of course they were never professed as bad, and retrospectively we can claim whatever we like, but we have no idea what claims will be made about the exercise of violence that occurs for benevolent reasons today. As one of my mentors, Talal Asad, has said, the motives of humanitarians must traverse through imperial structures. What that means, in effect, is first of all that the structure of global inequalities, dominated by rich and powerful countries, underpins all such actions, all such interventions are predicated on being in the position to intervene. So even if the human right to life is regarded as universal, not everyone is expected to step forward to defend it or has the ability to do so. So whose responsibility is it? And what does that say? One of the crucial attributes of humanitarian intervention, in the way in which it's been exercised, has to do also precisely from freedom from responsibility for what occurs in the places in which we intervene militarily. Whereas individual states continue to be held responsible, no matter how poorly they respond, if they respond at all, to the crimes they commit within their own borders. What happens when external powers intervene is that they are completely freed from a sense of responsibility for what happens after they leave. Iraq, which has remained mired in the most deadly civil war for years, is only the most searing current instance of this. And I'll only reiterate one last point here. Waging war to prevent further war, or waging war out of empathic motives, or waging war to save others, has very important historical antecedents. The project of European colonialism, whatever its professed intentions at the time, was predicated precisely on such an impulse, then called the civilizing mission. And of course, only with good intent. And here I'd like to clarify that it would be equally false to imagine humanitarian interventionists, or indeed anyone exercising power in the world, as a horrendous person, horrendous people cynically plotting the domination of the world. We shouldn't make the mistake of thinking that those in power sit around in dark suits smoking cigars and scheming the dispossession or deaths of thousands, if not millions. To impute evil, to think bad deeds are committed by bad people, is not to think at all. We're constantly told the framing is good guys and bad guys, and we just want to make sure that we're in the former and not the latter category. But I think that that's a mistake. It's necessary not to focus on intention, but on effects, intended and not. Thinking otherwise is a problem for several reasons, but also because even if it were the case that there were a few terrible characters conniving the manipulation of the universe, as Robert Burns reminds us, and as Steinbeck affirmed, the best laid schemes of mice and men often go awry. In other words, even if there were such a plan, it couldn't quite be so neatly executed. And bad deeds are, alas, also committed by good people. And finally, to conclude, I'd like to finish with another quote taken from George Orwell's 1984, which may raise yet more questions and possibly some demands for some concessions from power of power. So this is from George Orwell's 1984, when the leader of the thought police in the book, O'Brien, says to the protagonist, Winston Smith, quote, "Did I not tell you that we are different from the persecutors of the past? We are not content with negative obedience, nor even with the most abject submission. When finally you surrender to us, it must be of your own free will." Thank you. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer them.
So what's the cure?
I don't know that there's a cure, but I think that it's important to maintain a certain kind of critical and skeptical orientation towards what occurs in the world, and in particular what occurs in our name. Because it's also true that the media is more and more powerful. I mean, with the internet, etc., you're constantly bombarded with information. And it's very easy, because of course one would like to think one is good, and what's happening is in the name of good. And I think one of the ways in which we can understand what happens and the way in which things operate is to not assume that what we're being told is the entire truth. To maintain a critical, skeptical sensibility. I don't know. Do you have the cure? If you do, you can share it. Yes, please.
There's an article sort of making the rounds in social media from Al Jazeera about being critical about Americans, the American media not approaching, say, like this, the government shutdown with a sense of enlightening the public about what the shutdown is, and sort of slapping the hand of the American media about not doing their job journalistically to kind of analyze what the issues are. And it's kind of a naive question on my part, but I feel like oftentimes, and you can speak to this as somebody in the media, and somebody who's kind of in a media that like speaks to something that is off the beaten path, about examples of maybe even other countries where there's a better sense of journalistic checks and balances against the government, where people feel like they're being more informed, or that there are examples of, like you were saying just now in response to this first question, understanding that you're not getting the whole truth. Are there blueprints for a way in which journalism actually holds the government accountable to the issues at hand?
Not that I'm familiar with, but that's not to say that it doesn't exist. But actually, there was a very funny article, I don't know if you saw it, about the government shutdown. There was I think it was in Salon, I'm not sure, where there was an entire article written as though the shutdown was occurring in any other country in the world. It's absolutely hilarious. You guys have to look it up. I think it's Salon. And they basically say, you know, that there are these rival groups in this country that have taken over, and they have these tribal loyalties, and therefore they're, you know, compromising. They don't care about the interests of the people. They have these ancient grievances with one another. You know, it's complete, and it's absolutely, it's very, very funny. But no, I mean, I don't know that that there is a place that has. I mean, there are probably places that where there's more criticism of the media, or more of a critical orientation towards the media and towards the government in general, because there is, they have a longer tradition. Probably some countries in Europe, certainly in Asia, I mean in India, I think of India, they're, you know, much more critical of their state, because they've never seen their state as, you know, as quite as benevolent as the, you know. Although, you know, I also think it's true that the media all over the world is becoming more and more uniform. It's one of the things that I've noticed as well. I mean, wherever you go, you turn on the television and, you know, there are 100 24-hour news channels, which I really think are the death of information is 24-hour news. And they've got, not only is there some super, you know, made-up woman or whatever sitting there looking extremely happy reporting on the recent earthquake that killed millions, which also is, I think, the complete devastation. I mean, what that way of reporting news has done to our moral sensibility, I have absolutely no idea. That people should say, oh, today, you know, 300 people were burned to death in this terrible train crash. But on a lighter note, you know, tomorrow is going to be a sunny day. You know, I don't know, something like this. So, sorry, to go back to what I was saying, in every place that I've been recently, there is a certain uniformity, at least in television news, which is that the programs tend to be shorter and shorter. There are more distractions that appear on the screen when you watch it. In other words, there's a ticker going underneath. There are things flashing, you know, every now and again on the screen. All the presenters have a certain, you know, uniform appearance. So I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, I certainly can't name a place that has in any sense reached whatever one would construe as an ideal.
Do you feel like democracy now has the ability to be not in the pocket of someone, to be able to be more frank about their...
Well, I think think, you know, that's the thing with independent media, because I think the rise of at least 24-hour news in different places in the world has also been predicated on receiving the support of various corporations, etc., which, you know, without making a causal argument, I think it's still possible to say that that, in some sense, determines the content that is produced, both in terms of the content and the form that it's presented in. I do think that democracy now, because it's viewer funded, is free of those kinds of constraints, and I think it's a very, very good thing. It's also, I think, a very good thing that we're not a 24-hour news channel. Yes, please. Pardon me? In a very broad sense. I mean, violence, of course, I mean, the different things that I mentioned. I mean, there's physical violence, of course, the violence of war. Well, the psychic. Well, when I spoke about colonialism, what I meant is that in the same way in which, I mean, yeah, the analogous situation would be of indigenous peoples in the Americas, which is that when a foreign power comes in, which is, of course, more powerful for overdetermined reasons, and displaces the original inhabitants of a country, not just physically, but also culturally, in other words, by saying, now you must wear these clothes, speak this language, eat with these utensils, and study our texts, that is a form of violence which has extremely long-term effects, because what you're doing is that you're dispossessing people of the things that are most intimately theirs. Their language, their sensibility, the food that they eat, their gestures, their mode of life. And this is not to say that it's been a complete, obviously there's no such thing, the complete eradication although of course that has also occurred, of entire ways of life all over the world except for the colonial one. I'm not saying that's true. But what I am saying is that the effects of colonialism in formerly colonized countries is still palpable at that level, because it's created what, you know, in certain contexts, it's what they call class apartheid. Class apartheid. So in many countries, in what's called the third world or the developing world or the South, you have a certain class, which is of course the elite class, which speaks the colonial language with complete fluency and is completely at home in the metropolitan centers of London and Paris and so on. But they have absolutely no relationship to the vast majority of people who live in that same country, still speaking the indigenous language and some variation of the colonial language, but with not even close to that degree of fluency or comfort, who feel simultaneously, because it is a colonial context, a degree of self-hatred as a consequence of not having been able to master the master's tongue and the master's culture with everything that it entails. So that violence, you know, even if you're not killed by colonialism, that is, physically your life is not taken away from you, in a certain sense, many lives are taken away from you, not just now in the present or at the time that decolonization occurred or when colonialism was at its height, but for generations. You've robbed people of, and this is, again, I'm not making an argument that one culture is better than another culture. I'm not saying that was better, now why do we have this? It's not about that. It's just that that is a form of violence that we often don't recognize as ongoing. And it is, in fact, the truth of, you know, for billions of people around the world who have to negotiate this. But I mean, that's like, right. You're absolutely right about that, but to me that's analogous to saying that war has always occurred, so what's the issue? Or rape has always occurred, so what's the problem? It's not to say that, of course you're right, I'm sure that is true, that is what's... yes, you're right. That's true. But the first point with respect to trade is that the assumption is, in the example that you gave, is that it's what they call here a level playing field. In other words, there are two parties who are equal in all senses that matter, and they just, some person has, I don't know, a goat, and another person has, I don't know, a sheep or something, and they say, you take my goat, I'll take your sheep. No, but that's not the way that you trade. Sorry?
Never has.
Right. So that minimally, even if something has occurred historically, even if it's been repeated many, many times, it's not to say that the way in which, and it is a violence, right? It is violence. Violence has been repeated. Its form changes. And of course, we should keep in mind that the means we have to inflict violence of all of the different kinds that I've talked about is far greater than anything that existed before the 20th century. And I think that matters. It counts. Please.
I find that your perspective is very much something I relate to as a woman, that you use vocabulary that is more emotional, and I appreciate that in the context of politics. And someone today said to me, if 250 soccer moms went into the U.S. government today, we'd be able to figure things out. Do you have any opinion on that?
You know, it's very interesting because
in the context of being emotionally available, having something as a goal that makes us feel as though we can conquer.
I mean, that's a great question, but you know, to me, it's the same thing as saying, I mean, the impulse is the right one, but it's not to recognize that there are institutions in place which make it impossible for any gender to fulfill a policy, a mode of being, a mode of interacting, of relations, of war, of peace, outside of the framework that exists, which is why we have had many powerful women in many powerful positions all over the world, much like we've had people who have been historically disadvantaged in many parts of the world assume positions of power. And we see what occurs as a consequence. Now, maybe the difference is having 250 of them, but I don't think so. I don't, until there's some reckoning with these institutions that really have almost a self-propelling logic. I don't think that, you know, any number of women or anyone else is going to make much difference. Yes, please.
Do you think the increase of Al Jazeera and possibly the Guardian will affect U.S. news reporting in any possible way?
Oh, I definitely think so. I think it's really great. I think having, Al Jazeera Americas, I'm not sure because it's just begun and it's kind of displaced Al Jazeera English, and it's too early to say, as it were, what the effect of that will be and, you know, what kind of content they'll be producing. But I think it's great that the Guardian is here. And, you know, I was just on a panel the other night in New York, which was on the media at CUNY, and I was amazed at the number of people, in fact, who now turn to the Guardian, who, you know, never even, you know, why would anyone in the U.S. read a British publication, a British broadsheet? But I think it's good because you get all kinds of information from these websites, or if you have cable and you happen to get Al Jazeera from TV that you would never ever have access to. And it's not just the stories, but it's the perspective that's given on the stories,
right,
which I think is absolutely crucial. And I really hope so. I certainly hope so for the media and for a lot of independent journalists, because a lot of independent journalists, people who are just writing blogs, just starting out, whatever, they tend to turn much more to these sources which are not new to them, right? They're young and, you know, so they've come, they're starting to work when these, this kind of information is already accessible to them. So they don't just automatically go whatever to ABC News or the New York Times or whatever it is. They're much more open. So I think that's a great development. And I think the more there are of these, the better. The person in the corner.
So I think it seems like you're talking kind of a macro perspective of violence on a whole and American perspective. But my question is in relation to Palestine and Israel. I'm sorry. But how I would be interested in hearing your perspective about how that issue is cycled through the media and maybe what are some of the options from Al Jazeera and then
Yeah, you know, obviously that's, you know, there's a way in which certain topics, certain issues are, the way in which they're covered by the mainstream media seems often to be so heavily weighted to one side, or let's say not sufficiently giving a voice to the other side, that I think independent media, and for all kinds of reasons, of political reasons and other reasons, that independent media, I think, can play a very important role. Not necessarily, again, it's not a question of making a decision or taking a position on a conflict, but simply presenting all the sides that exist in a conflict. And I think that at least Al Jazeera English, again, Al Jazeera America I'm not sure of because they've just started, but Al Jazeera English, I think, on Israel-Palestine, both because they had access, they had journalists who were in Israel and in Palestine, speaking Hebrew and Arabic, which of course, you know, is, you know, very helpful in covering this conflict, which, you know, virtually no one here who covers the conflict speaks either. So they were able to present a much more complicated and much more in-depth perspective on that problem, let's say. And I hope that Al Jazeera Americas will be able to continue doing that, because I think it really does serve as a corrective to the inadequate representation of the other side, as it were, in the U.S. media, for you know, whatever the interests of the U.S. itself, for whatever reasons. I think it is very important, and I think it is very good, the role that Al Jazeera played. Anyone else? Please.
Well, I was just wondering if you have any insight on why the major cable companies have chosen to not put Al Jazeera America on the air. I mean, I suppose that there is lobbyist answers to that. But on the other hand, it's I find it to be a pretty objective presentation of the news. Objective, although maybe in that contrast with the more limited way that cable channels and the network news and so forth present facts. But it's a quality broadcast. You know, distinguished journalists who wouldn't be working there. Most of them, perhaps, you know, almost all of them, if it weren't an objective source of the news or any way slanted. So I find it that just don't quite understand what interest the Comcast and the Time Warners have in keeping it off their cable broadcast.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Al Jazeera sounds kind of like I mean, so people talk incessantly about Barack Hussein Obama. You know, I don't know. I just feel like the entire. I mean, there is something about the general culture that has produced a sense that anything that is tainted, even tainted, with anything that might be vaguely of a particular religion, is bad and probably a terrorist. So I think that if Al Jazeera renamed itself, I don't know, Global News Now or something, I don't know, maybe they would pick it up. And the other thing, because I think you're right, I think Al Jazeera English anyway did a fabulous job of presenting, you know, many different perspectives, including, you know, US perspectives. But what they did, which I think was their singular achievement for the global media, is to constantly present situations around the world from a truly South perspective of the South, and I mean the global South, by which I mean the third world, but also of the poor, the dispossessed, all over Europe and in the US. So I don't think, I mean, what do I know what cable companies think? But I would speculate that I don't think it has to do so much with what they were actually showing. I think you're right when you talk about the quality of their coverage. I think it has to do with all of the associations with a channel that is, after all, funded by this, Gulf state, which is in the Middle East, which is, God knows, and then this name which conjures all kinds of demons and ghosts and so on. So I don't know. I mean, that's my guess.
What would happen? What kind of reaction would I sort of imagine? What would be the reaction if let's say Time Warner Cable put Al Jazeera America on here? Would there be some sort of major, sort of large public?
I would think absolutely not.
Exactly.
I think maybe, I don't know, Colgate would pull its advertising or something, but I don't think that people would come out and, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't think people would care. In fact, I think many people would probably be very happy.
It is a bit, as you say, I can't get inside the minds of the decision makers.
Please, sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Sorry.
Sorry. You talked about the resistance of the institutions of power to change, and I was curious whether you thought that was, so I have two possible ideas that might be, but you might have others. But I was wondering if you thought it was more about the influence of money within those institutions, like lobbying and all of that, or whether it's just sort of a self-selection issue where the people that are in power now have managed to successfully navigate the structures of power as they exist currently, so they are resistant to the idea of changing them because then they won't know what to do.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right, probably on both counts, and also that that there's so many institutions that take that shape, and that those institutions have linkages between them, and that because these institutions are independently so powerful, together they're, just ginormously powerful, so that even changing one slightly barely creates a ripple through the rest. It's a very, and that's why I'm so interested. I don't think I don't know the answer, but I'm extremely interested in the way that power is changing and is simultaneously appears to be everywhere, and yet it's nowhere. Like when the French Revolution occurred, people knew where to go. They went outside, whatever, Versailles, and they were like, where would one go now? Would one, I don't know, demonstrate outside of Boeing or outside the White House or outside, or outside NBC News? I don't know. Because everything seems to be connected, or the Pentagon for that matter. Everything seems to be connected, and yet you don't know. You know that in a sense it's the White House, but is it really only the White House? We just, the elections that just occurred were the most expensive elections in the history of humanity, right? It's billions of dollars. So you know that Barack Obama as a single individual he's neither here nor there, it doesn't matter. He's a placeholder. The person who can hold that position is the person who can get billions of dollars to fund his election. So what does that say about, I don't know, what does that say about institutions? What does that say about where power is located and how it can be altered?
Do you think that might be why the Occupy Wall Street group protested basically everywhere? Because there was no sense of a locus of power.
Yeah, they did go to Zuccotti Park, which
right.
is of course Wall Street, which is, and that's a very, yeah,
city.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, please.
What I find disturbing locally is that Maine public television has refused to carry Democracy Now!, despite that several years ago there was a statewide petition drive to carry Democracy Now!, and they refused to do it, and they still don't do it. And at that time I talked with Charles Beck, who was the program director. I don't know if he's still with someone else. Is he still? And what he said to me, he said, I have listened to a tape of Amy Goodman. That's all right? And he said, and we don't want to carry her. I said, well, why not? Oh no, we have liberals. We have BBC.
said.
In the 1960s, they did. But that is really frightening. Non-profit.
So what did he say in response when you said that that's what we have public television for?
I don't know. I think I'm so angry I didn't listen. But we never, I mean, that was maybe 10 years ago, and we still don't have it on public television. We fortunately have community stations that can have
It is. It's extremely unfortunate, and that's one of the things that that is connected to what this young man also asked me. It's about the nature of power. See, so what they're doing in this case is they're not censoring you, right? Democracy Now! Can broadcast or Al Jazeera for that matter. We can broadcast, but we just won't be broadcast in enough places that enough people can hear us, that we can influence the debate the way that it occurs, you know, public discourse in the way that it is shaped in this country. And that is, to me also, that's a very interesting question about the form that censorship now takes. You know, it's not explicit, it's not, that's not the way it's done, it's precisely this kind of, the example that you gave. And why is it? Even if it were the case, right? Say it is the case, we are biased, say it, if that were true. If that's true, it's also true that ABC News is biased, NBC is biased, the New York Times is biased, the LA Times is biased, Washington Post is biased. How could the Washington Post print 1,000 columns on the war in Iraq and give 36 words? Is that not, what is that? Is that not biased? Is that an objective account of what occurred? And that's the problem. I'm not even going to claim objectivity. Much like I'm not going to defend people when they say, oh, you know, MSNBC is pro-Democrat or Fox News is pro-Republicans or the Tea Party. That's probably true. But why is it that therefore they are not taken off the air? But Democracy Now!, because we don't speak to all these experts in suits who are holding forth, as Amy says, who knows so much about so little about so much, rather. Why is that? Because that's the only form of information that the public is allowed to consume? Because if they were given other kinds of information from people who frankly are much more like them, well then what would happen? Right? Anyway, but thank you for telling that. I had no idea. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if you could say anything, whatever might strike you, about social media and how news is increasingly fragmented and we're getting little bits here and there, but we're able to get it from our friends, perhaps what they have decided to disseminate. It's just a really new and different way of disseminating information, and I personally haven't decided necessarily whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but yeah, do you have any comments on social media as a power in distributing information?
I mean, look, in some sense, I think it's very good, especially in the context that this lady was talking about, where you aren't able to get the kind of information that maybe you want from a traditional media source. The fact that it's now available to you on, I don't know, Facebook or YouTube from some, whether it's a blogger or what they call now citizen journalists, etc., I think that's a very good thing. And you know, in that sense, I mean, when we covered, for example, the revolts when they were beginning in the Arab world, it was extraordinarily helpful because we, you know, obviously we don't have the kind of staff and resources to have correspondence in these places, although in Egypt we did with Sharif. But you know, we could be in touch with people, with local journalists, as a result of which we were able to get access to video. That would never have been possible before because everybody has a camera and everything. So in that sense, it's very good. But also, I think that the internet, social media is democratic in another sense, which is not such a good sense, which is that it's not just people who are simply providing information or critical information. There are people who are saying all kinds of ghastly things on the internet, and you also, of course, are bombarded with that. So I don't know. I mean, I guess it's kind of a mixed thing. In a certain sense, it's extremely helpful, just by virtue of the fact that it diversifies the kind of information that one has access to, and it gives one access to information one would never have access to. But at the same time, you know, you have to be kind of well trained to be able to see what is legitimate and what is not, because there's also an enormous amount of it, and a lot of it is not so
So maybe the same problem that we have with mainstream media then.
That's right, that's right, except much exponentially
Right.
multiplied. Yes, that's right. Yes, please.
I think that corporatism is widely misunderstood as a concept, kind of like that corporatism is like economic violence more than just like than a company per se. And that's kind of like, I kind of see it that way myself, but I feel like maybe like it's an intellectual concept. And like to change minds about it, we have to transform like intellectual concepts into simple like obvious concepts. The kind of what I'm saying is like the idea of like banking is how to if this country is owned basically by large financial interests in the sense that every elected official has to capitulate to lobbyists on some level, no matter what their political affiliation is. You almost have to like frighten people economically, like how do you solve the problem of big bank? Like what if everybody just pulled their money out of a big bank like once they bring their progressive values and just like wipe that bank right off the map? Like I'm not saying I want to put everybody who works for a bank out of work, but like how do you like I know that's kind of like a lot of ideas in one.
But the thing is that I see your point, and it's well taken, but the thing is that corporations are now they're not just national, right? And they're not just concrete, right? Because one of the things that happened in the US and therefore in the global economy was the transformation from an economy that was based on manufacturing and on actual products that you could touch and feel and buy and know that you owned in some material, quite literally material, physical sense, to a finance economy where what you're trading and what you own is completely, literally immaterial, right? So it's not real money. It's not even real, it doesn't exist anywhere. What they call, whatever, the financialization of the economy. And also it's dispersal, right? Because so now even if you were to pull out, if progressives, however many there are, or people on the left, in the US were to pull out of Citibank, well, I mean, yes, it matters, but first of all, it wouldn't constitute enough of a number, and Citibank is now literally probably in every country, in every country in the world, or at least the vast majority of them. So, I don't know, and corporatism, I don't know that I even know necessarily what that means, but that corporate power, right, that there is such a thing as corporate power, and corporate power has to do with the extent to which corporations exercise power, and exercise power in very crucial decision-making institutions in this country and around the world. And that power is not something, because we don't elect CEOs of, Citibank or Chase Manhattan. But we know that they have an enormous influence on the people whom we do, in some vague sense, elect in this completely opaque electoral system. So it's very hard to pinpoint what it would mean to dismantle that structure, because it exceeds not only a specific institution, it exceeds not only a specific place, it also exceeds materiality in terms of what constitutes their economic power. I'm sorry if that's kind of
No, that's kind of what I was
obscure.
Yeah,
it's even obscure to me what I said.
Yeah, but I'm trying to suggest it with the idea that what is a corporation really like everybody has like a mythology of a corporation as being an entity or whatever. It's like, but when you look at how they're all interconnected in politics and stuff now, like you said, it's kind of intangible what a corporation really is, and like maybe we create progressive, like a more progressive language would be like break down a corporation of this bank or a corporation of Walmart or a corporation of that. What do you have to look at them individually?
Sorry?
You have to look at them kind of on a case-by-case basis and see what they give back, how they affect what they buy. I don't know.
You could look at each individually, but I think the distinctions between them are not as important as the things that they share in common. If you see what I mean. In other words, what Walmart does versus what Citibank does versus what Boeing does, they all do different things, right? Boeing makes you bombs, and whatever, Walmart makes you, I don't know what, gives your employees like $2 an hour, and whatever. and Citibank, I don't know, hoards your money and this kind of thing. But I think that is not so important as their global presence and and what they do in different places around the world. I think that is important. How they treat their employees is important. But beyond that, I don't think that because what they do collectively is constitute an enormous power. I mean, now I don't have a very good recollection or memory for numbers and statistics and so on. But corporations have more money than the GDPs of many countries in the world. That's how much money they have now. And that's saying an enormous amount. I mean, individual corporations, Apple or whatever, and certainly together, their power, their economic power, their pure financial power is far greater than it's ever been. And that is something that they share in common. If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, somebody told me that somebody told me that the way that America is structured, that manufacturing jobs are inevitably going to be brought back to the U.S. at some point, and that at that point, or to an extent, when the common people are desperate, and then that would wipe out, would increase poverty in third world countries, and actually, is that a completely same concept?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think some people are already desperate, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think people's desperation is what moves companies, you know what I'm saying? Please.
Hey, Nermeen. So.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't even see properly without talking to you.
So in the last decade, it was vexing to the observers as to what type of system of government China had, how it could be described. And recently, President Carter said that we no longer have functioning democracy. He didn't say what it is that we have left. As an observer of political systems around the world, what do you think, what type of system of government do we presently have working in America?
What is the present system of government in America? Well, I think that whatever it is, even though I do think that something like when we proclaim America's democratic credentials, some of which are of course true, we should think that democracy is always an incomplete thing in any case. It's like you can never be so it's always. But I think that in the U.S. what I find extraordinary, first of all, I was stunned by the sheer resources that were put into elections for I don't even know how long, decades. Why, if a country is democratic, which means really that it's for the people, why would it cost so much money to want to represent the people in an elected it's an elected office, right? You are essentially a servant of the people, a government servant. That is your job as the president of any, or the head of state of any country. And that seems to have been completely lost in this context. That elections cost so much money, that people who govern us are so removed from us and removed from, and in class terms. And that's the other thing in the US, even though, it's probably one of the most unequal. I read something recently, I can't remember, there was a report brought out that levels of inequality now in the US are comparable to levels of inequality in some of the most unequal third world countries. It's a moral abomination that this should exist in the richest country in the world and what was at some point considered among the most democratic. You can't have a democracy when you have such searing and growing inequality. I don't think it's possible, because then your ruling class is completely removed from the people whom they're supposed to be representing. So I don't know, what do you call a system like that? Minimally not a democratic one, I don't know.
Autocracy.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. That's what people say, autocracy.
Will it ever get back?
Sorry?
I'm sorry. Will it ever get back?
Will it ever get better?
Yes, to a real democracy, when we don't have such disparity of wealth.
Well, I certainly hope so, but I'm not sure that hope is all that's required. And on top of that, even if hope were not all that were required, I don't know what else would be required. I find it, I don't know, I think that it's really, and that's why this question of power interests me, because I think that even if people were to be, and again, this is all completely counterfactual, maybe if everybody listened to Democracy Now! Every day, or watched Democracy Now! Everybody was like, oh my God, what's going on? Let's, storm something, I don't know. But maybe not. So it's very interesting to me to try to understand the way in which this power operates so as to be able to think of how best to either negotiate it or in some sense undo it. But I don't know how that's going to happen because I already see, not just here, but in so many other places, levels of inequality where we're supposed to be living. And in many senses, there are people who enjoy incredible pleasures and, of all kinds, access to knowledge and to, obviously many basic services and so on. But at the same time that you have people living in such utter destitution, it's absolutely, it's unconscionable. And it's unconscionable that it's gone on for as long as it has. It's unconscionable that it occurs in the most powerful country in the world, and that nothing happens. Nothing. I don't know. To me, it's stunning. So what would it take to change that? If you have any ideas, please email democracynow.org. Please.
So instead of a solution, if you could just paint what you think the outcome would be, because I try to think about that, and I don't see an outcome either. So not even just the solution, but what that image is.
Look, I think one of the, I often think of this quote, although it's a terrible thing to say. Kafka, in a conversation with a friend of his, he said, yes, hope, there's plenty of hope, just not for us. Now, that's obviously not the note that one should end on. But I think that it is possible to see, there are moments where in small pockets you see some kind of, redemption, something gets better for some person in the world, you know what I'm saying? That does happen, but how that could be more, that well-being could be more broadly distributed, I have no idea. One thing that I do think of, I certainly don't think of living in some kind of utopic dream world at all, but minimally in this country and also globally, because the inequality that exists here is mirrored, it's across countries, it's within countries, and I think that's something that capitalism generates. And now we live in a time where I think capitalism has really run, not just wild, it's beyond insane. That kind of inequality is really not sustainable. Something has to break at some point. Capitalism can keep going. It can't keep going at this pace. So that minimally what can hope for and I don't know, see in some instances is some attempt at redistribution. Some minor even attempt, even if it's through, some kind of government program to provide services. The cost of education in this country now, it's like what, now only the rich can study, can go to a school that will actually allow them to graduate being literate? What kind of lowest common denominator is this? In the most, and I'm sorry I repeat it so often because I myself am so stunned by it, that this is the most powerful country in the world and this is what it's doing to its own people? Please.
When I'm discouraged and overwhelmed by facts that you so beautifully speak from and to, I read Daniel Berrigan and Chris Hedges. And Daniel Berrigan had hospitality, and when he was, the feds were after him at William Stringfellow's home. And William Stringfellow was also a mentor of Chris Hedges. William Stringfellow wrote a book called For Christians and Other Aliens in a Strange Land. And it's, for many civil rights activists, it's a source of hope and movement and courage. And he looks at the very powerful principalities that you talk about that are in the institutions beyond the placeholder. There are chapters on their aims There are characteristics of these principalities that seem to just be in a sphere of energy beyond what we can imagine. And both of these gentlemen, all three of these people, they're not into religiosity, which is so abhorrent and hateful, but they have a humble quality of their faith. And I think all across every country, there are people who are humble and have a quality of faith, however it's defined, that are those pockets that you talk about, that are doing something that's good for the common, for our commons. And those are the people that I just go to. And I imagine people all over this world, in each of their states, have those kinds of people, and I wish we could talk about that as well.
You know, I thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a very, very important point. And that one of the things that we can do, and I often think of it as, of course, we all narcissistically do about myself, that, when you are in whatever community, wherever it is that you live and work and so on, study, I remember being so completely moved by just reading, or not moved is too minor, small feeling. I was absolutely blown out of the world by reading some of the people that I read, and simply knowing that there are people in the world, wherever they may be, 100 million miles away from me, and yet they can see what's happening. They can see certain things. It's like the kind of affinity you feel when you watch something or read something and you think, oh, finally, look, this person gets it, right? So if one can aspire to be that in a conversation with somebody, in in writing something, or do whatever it is that one does, in whatever work one does, and in one's personal life and professional life, if one can somehow produce that, I think it's extraordinarily powerful. And in these pockets, in this, just knowing that people, have taken a stand or have done things in moments of great adversity, I think it gives one a certain kind of a courage, and maybe eventually hope.
At one point, I used to find politics fun. Right? I mean, I really did. I mean, I find local government in some cases works better than the federal government, because you're voting the individual, you're not voting a horse or a donkey or whatever you're voting for. And then you do at the state, federal level, you're voting a party. That I think a lot of times it's better when you're voting at the local government works better, because you're voting for the person himself. Now, in my case, I was inspired by John Kennedy. I was also inspired by Colin Powell. Two different sides of the aisle, but I vote both because I believe in their principles. Same thing with Bill Clinton or some other guys that inspired me, that believed in what I want. They seem to have to touch with reality. What I find is Congress, the Senate, and a lot of those guys that are in there, the Boehners and these other guys have been there forever, have lost touch with reality. They've lost touch with what all of us want. And I think in general, they're all, personally, they're probably great guys. Okay, I've met John McCain, I've met a bunch of them, and they're probably great guys. I may not see eye to eye with them politically, like the old man down in Kenny, but he's a funny guy. But I don't see eye to eye politically, but, they have their good points and their good points. How much of it is that they've just lost touch with what we all want? And I think if we collaboratively got together, how much is it just, why don't we just vote the person and forget about their title? Just vote the person and with their principle.
Well, there are two things. I think you're right. I'm sure. I have no doubt that, as someone, I can't remember in what context this conversation was occurring, but it was basically about this question of being good or bad or so on. And, this person pointed out to me, which is actually apparently a historical fact, that even Hitler was very nice to his cats. You know what I'm saying? Which is not to say that that the people you cited were Hitler, but that even people who are capable of the most monstrous deeds also, of course, are sometimes nice. So, then the second point is that we don't have the option to vote for a person with principle. Because even if they start out with principles, the system is absolutely corrupting. At least that seems to be what occurs. There's no other, to my mind, there's no other explanation for it. Because I'm sure all of the people, not all of them, but some of them certainly, who come into elected office, not just here, but elsewhere, actually believe something that is for the common good, which is why they want to serve, you know, the people, even though that idea has somehow been obscured. And yet that's not what seems to happen in most cases. So I think that there's something that's deeply, deeply wrong with the system as it's come to be structured that has nothing to do with the individual.
Well, a prime example was in Massachusetts, where I'm from. Billy Bulger, for years, was the president of the Senate. He was elected by the ones from South Boston, by the South Boston Irish, and he was very strong within the Irish community. When he decided that he wasn't going to run for re-election, he was going to step down and become president of UMass, there was a good candidate that was coming in out of South Boston that got overshadowed because Bulger and all his power got behind the other guy. Well, the other guy turned around, got his seat in the Senate in Mass, and turned around, because of that power, got the seat to replace Ted Kennedy. I could be wrong, maybe it was in Congress, but he got the congressional seat. And it was totally all wrong. The guy was as corrupt as you could ever be because he was linked to Bulger. And Bulger, for the lack of anything, I mean, personally he's a great guy, but he's definitely corrupt. And the fact that he always comes, and he earmarked a guy to hand-pick a guy to go in and now represent the state of Massachusetts. And in Congress, when there was another guy that was more in touch with what we wanted, and he just, because of all that, that's the problem with government today. That's my problem with it. That's why I think it's like, people got to stand up and say, screw the Bulges of the world, screw these other ones, and say, listen, let's vote your conscience, vote the guy who's going to best do it for you. Not because they're aligned with this guy here, and whatever.
Or women.
Yes, please.
Following up on that, can you provide an analysis of Barack Obama, what's happened to this guy?
No.
Okay, fair enough.
You want me to give an evaluation of what happened to Obama once he came into office?
Yeah, if you have one, or if you think he just was like this from the get-go.
You know, I have very little insight into that. The only thing that I can think of is that there is something about the position that he came to occupy, which is why I think that the emphasis on the individual is a problem. It's the institution that one has to think of. One has to think of the White House and of Congress and of the Pentagon and of all these corporations, and we have to think of the fact that we live in the most powerful country in the world, and we have to think that this power has a logic of its own. And those people who are not interested in continuing to project that power on their own people and elsewhere in the world will simply be selected out of the system. I think it's something like that. I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that that's how this increasingly works.
It's almost like a poster child.
It's a haunted house, basically.
Only. A haunted house? Did someone say that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Haunted by what we don't know. Yes?
In relation to what he asked, what can our country do to help communities? How should we react to what's happening in Syria? We're becoming more and more isolated.
Well, you know, that's an interesting question, because that was something that was discussed at length, especially most recently, as you say, in the context of Syria. And I think that, you know, that's also the question that is raised regarding a violence that's carried out to prevent further violence. Which is not to say that that violence doesn't prevent further violence. It may well do that. But that if you're part of the solution, you're also definitely part of the problem. And so, you know, extricating yourself from the responsibility that comes with that involvement is something that, you know, tends to occur with too much ease and a sense of having accomplished the mission. I mean, now we are, you know, next week is 12 years, 12-year anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan. And in March, it was 10 years since Iraq. And it's not obvious to me that these societies have greatly benefited from the impulse to help, even if one forget Afghanistan, which was, you know, whatever, a war of self-defense, so it was said. But in the case of Iraq, I'm not sure that the majority of people in Iraq think that their society is better off now, that they have, after all, been freed of this dreadful dictator. That's true. But what has happened as a consequence to the vast majority of people who live there? In other words, I don't think it's possible in any context, and that includes, I'm afraid, also Syria. It's not, which is not to say that one doesn't wish that what were happening would not be happening. Of course, I do. But I also don't think that the solution lies, or the end to that suffering lies with an external power coming in and intervening and stopping that particular form of violence from being inflicted. Because of course, human beings are very, very inventive when it comes to inventing newer and more brutal forms of violence and suffering, so that if we removed Saddam Hussein, but there are literally millions of people who've died in Iraq. I mean, I don't remember the numbers, but the number of people who've died in Iraq as a consequence of the ouster of Saddam Hussein and whatever institutions it is that were in place, it's enormous. And that Baghdad, I don't know, all these places that were absolutely, you know, livable and that provided basic services to their people are no longer able to do so. So you remove one evil, but you allow several other evils to come in their place. And without even saying which is better, it's clear that that an intervention is not a solution. So that's a kind of, do you see?
I mean, we may have time for one or two more questions.
One or two more questions.
People may want to talk to you in person after this.
Yes, please, the red beret.
So can we say that the response to the violence of power is to resist it non-violently?
We could say that. We could, but we don't know whether we would be right. That's one option. But I also think that given the scale of the violence that's perpetrated, that's an almost impossible demand to make of other people. But at the same time, I don't think that responding violently resolves the problem. Well, thank you all very, oh, sorry, one last.
Well, I was just going, you've quoted Kafka, and this, I'm going to find out more about the Zimbabwe author. And
she's amazing. You have to, yeah, I mean, you don't have to, of course, but I think
I will.
It's an amazing book.
Orwell. I'm wondering what you think about the power of art in this whole, I think everybody in this room probably basically agrees with you, but there are a whole lot of people who don't, but they do read novels, they go to movies, they look at art. I wonder if there is a transformative power. I don't think any real artist wants power. That's not why he or she creates. But do you think that right now, I mean, we can think of Picasso, Guernica, and Goya, and Rouault, and the power that they had, but let's retrospective, we're looking back. Are there artists right now who possibly, well, you've already mentioned Zimbabwe, who have that power to help us change?
You know, thank you so much. It's a great note to end on, because I love literature, I love film, and I find it's the same thing, what the lady at the back asked me as well, about, you know, feeling a sense of resonance. You read something, you see something, you look at visual art, you look at a film, and something happens. I can't say what that something is, but something occurs. And there's something in literature, in film, There are things that can be conveyed that can't be conveyed in any other medium than the medium in which you experience them. And I think that is powerful in ways that certainly reading a newspaper, at least for me, is absolutely not. Because it's something that stays with you. You know, these things, the things that I cited, these are things that I read years ago. I mean, the most recent is a Zimbabwean, whom I read 2 years ago, though. But how is it that these ideas kind of linger, and they give you a way of understanding things and seeing and perceiving? Because the thing with artists, I mean, sorry to indulge in a spectacular cliche, but they have a kind of, at least in my experience, the ones that I read or I appreciate, they appear to have an acuity of perception for a certain kind of truth that all of the rest of us appear to be blind to. So I can't recommend literature enough. Thank you so much.